Hello, I'm Ben Lorica. I am the principal at Gradient Flow and the host of the Data Exchange podcast. AI is the backbone of today's buzziest products and technologies, whether it's self-driving cars, conversational assistants, and even our home appliances like our vacuum cleaners. As these applications grow in both the consumer and enterprise spaces, themes of reliability, trust, and safety in these algorithms are rightfully taking front and center. That's why I'm excited to share a recording of a recent conversation I had on Twitter Spaces with Bob Friday, Chief AI Officer of Juniper Networks, and Andrew Burt, Managing Partner of BHN.AI. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out directly to myself or any of our panelists on Twitter or LinkedIn. Without further ado, here's the conversation sponsored by Juniper Networks. Today, we have two pioneers in the space who I've known for a long time. First, we have Bob Friday. He is one of the first chief AI officers that I know that have that title, which tells you how important AI is to Juniper Networks. And secondly, we have Andrew Burt, who is managing partner of the first law firm focused specifically on AI and machine learning risks. So welcome, Andrew and Bob.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here.
So let's start with a baseline. What is your definition of trust? Specifically, in your mind, what makes AI trustworthy?
So there are lots of different ways of thinking about trust. And my shorthand definition of trust is basically that it's a probability relationship. So trust is really just the probability of something doing what you expect it to do. And so when we talk about AI, the question is, when we talk about AI trust, the question is how likely is this AI system to do what it is I expected? And I'll just add that one of the reasons why trust is so important and critical with AI is because AI is so complicated, it's so complex, that it can be quite difficult for users or even operators of AI systems to understand that probability, to have high confidence in the system doing what it is it's supposed to do.
So, Andrew, as a follow-up, what does it mean for data teams and data scientists today who are trying to build trustworthy AI? So what are some of the key considerations and steps or even tools? And I ask you this because I know you talk to a lot of teams, not just data teams, but even chief legal counsels who are very concerned with these issues.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say that like all day, every day, I spend my time at B&H helping organizations who are really struggling with what it means to make their AI trustworthy and responsible with a focus on AI liabilities. And so I'll just, I guess, kind of make 2 points and stay really, really practical, which is I'll rephrase your question to say, like, what is it that teams can actually do to make their AI trustworthy? And more than that, what is the highest impact things that they can do? And so I'll name 2 things. The first is appeal and override, making sure that users of AI systems can flag when things go wrong, and operators of AI systems can override any decisions that might be creating potential harms or any incidents. That's the first thing. We see a lot of times in practice AI systems being deployed without appeal and override functionality. One second. Without appeal and override functionality. And so what that really means is that just deploying a system with no way of getting feedback from its users is basically a big no-no and leads to all sorts of risk. And the second thing teams can do just quite quickly is standardized documentation across Data science teams is extremely fragmented, and that creates a huge amount of risk. And so something as simple as just standardizing how systems are documented can go a really long way. And so, Bob, quick review. So, from your perspective, how would you define trustworthy AI? Number one, and number two, what are some initial steps that you and your team are doing?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think from my perspective, there's kind of three dimensions to this AI trust discussion right now. One is what I call consumer safety. This is kind of what we're seeing happen in Europe around the CE mark, right? Trying to make sure these new AI products are actually do what they claim to do and are safe. So there's kind of what I call the regulation part of trust coming on. There's also kind of what I call the ESG, environmental, social governance trust, right? This is basically where our investors want to trust we're doing the right thing with AI. And then finally, there's kind of what I call the user trust, right? These are people who are actually using our AI products. They want to make sure that we have trust built into the product. They want to be able to trust these AI assistants on par with humans. And then to your question, really what are we doing here at Juniper with this? Our first step here is really coming out with AI guidelines. So, if you go Google Juniper AI guidelines principles, you'll see that Juniper actually has principles now around AI.
So, Andrew, and Bob brought up the notion of regulations. And I know this is something you have to pay close attention to, since you do talk to the chief legal counsels of many of these large companies. There are so many regulations in this area. So for our listeners, what regulations need to be kept in mind, both in the short and long term? So that's a great question. Honestly, there are so many, and frankly, there's so many that are overlooked. I'll just go through them. So there's municipal level, state level, and federal level. Just in the U.S., and that's ignoring all of the big important stuff that's happening in the EU. At the municipal level, there's a really interesting law that comes into effect in January in New York City. And basically, any AI system being used in an employment context in New York City needs to be audited. And that's frankly quite a big deal. What it means for these systems to be audited, who can audit them, how those audits work. And so that's the municipal level. At the state level, there are already laws on the books in Virginia, Colorado, even California, that mandate all sorts of different transparency and transparency and impact assessment requirements on AI systems. So those are laws that have already been passed and are beginning to be enforced. And then at the federal level, there are a host of different proposed regulations. The big one is the American Data Privacy and Protection Act. But just to step back, basically all of these laws at a high level require different kinds of impact assessments or third-party audits of AI systems. And so even though there's a lot of variety in what the laws mandate, at a high level, they're starting to require basically the same things. That's a great point. So, Bob, over to you. As far as regulations, are there any specific ones that you're paying attention to?
I think right now, if I look what's happening in Europe, is, it looks like Europe is starting to come out with regulations around safety, right? Where they're starting to identify specifically AI applications, self-driving cars, AI applications that are doing with HR bias, and they're starting to identify these apps, and they're going to start running them through, frameworks like CE, right? To kind of ensure that these AI apps don't do harm, just as you would with any other product safety. So in Europe, I think I'm seeing much more of a centralized regulatory approach. In the U.S., it looks like it's much more distributed across the different frameworks, right? FDA, each different group inside of the U.S. is starting to come up with their own AI regulations, their own regulations around AI.
So let me broaden this a little bit. And for this question, you don't have to answer specifically about trust. It could be on any specific AI risks that you are paying attention to or that you see other teams paying attention to. So are there any AI risk mitigation techniques that you want to highlight for our audience that you think are especially best practices? So, Andrew, you had mentioned documentation. So anything else that comes to mind? It's funny because the big thing, what I find myself and other folks at B&H telling our clients over and over again is just documentation and appeal and override. Those two things can go so far. But because I already said both of those, I'll just also add model monitoring. We see very, very frequently data science teams basically emphasizing two things: time to deployment and accuracy metrics. And so they feel like if they can get a high accuracy model and they can get that model deployed quickly, like they're good and they've done their job. And very frequently model monitoring kind of falls out of the picture. And so ensuring that model monitoring efforts are stood up can be a really, really effective risk mitigant.
And how about you, Bob? Are there any specific tools or sets of processes or checklists that either you're implementing today or plan to implement or are inspired by?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the engineering side, right, for the actual engineers who are building and deploying these models, if you dig into that, you'll find out they have tools like MLflow. These are basically tools that when you train a model, you have to look for data drift, right? Once the model's trained, you want to make sure the data that you trained it on and the data that's coming in real time, there's not a big delta. So there's tools like that to make sure your models are kept up to date, and trained on the latest data that represents the data coming in. I think inside of Juniper, inside of companies, beyond just building product, there's kind of the new risk we have this in the company, right? Whether it's an HR department buying AI tools or a supply chain, and I think right now for almost all large companies, right, we all have training modules that we go through: ethics training, awareness training on what's right and wrong, governance. So I think we're going to start to see that being baked into our company training programs, right, where we go through ethics training. We'll start to see AI be making people more aware of what they're doing, and when they're buying AI tools, what they should be aware of.
And can I just add to that? Sorry, Ben, tell me if I'm messing with the flow. But one thing I'll also add, which I neglected, is just having clear policies in place. What Bob said is, I think, absolutely critical, just like monitoring for data drift. But one thing we see all the time is that the regularity or the formality of when things are monitored and checked can be a highly, highly variable. So just having some clear policy in place, and whether it's ongoing active monitoring for drift or just some type of periodic testing to see what might have changed between training and deployment. So just having clear policies written down, having everyone understand what those are so they don't deviate too much across teams and time, that can also be a really highly effective risk mitigant.
So, Andrew, what is the nature of your conversations around these topics these days? I know that in the past when we've spoken, you've expressed the opinion that you felt that data teams were still a little resistant to having some of these checklists or extra tools or extra requirements.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, we're kind of crashing the AI party. And I'll say that one thing that I see all the time and is just true is just there is so much hype around AI. And frankly, there's so many organizations that talk about AI that aren't actually seriously deploying it. And so kind of cutting through the hype and getting to the actual kind of use cases, because we're a law firm, people don't tend to call lawyers unless they're worried about getting in trouble. And so the conversations that I have and that folks, other folks at the law firm have, are focused on different types of liabilities. How might this existing law impact an organization? How might a future law impact an organization? There are a number of different AI incidents. You can go there's actually stood up, I think last year, the AI incident database, which just centralizes all the bad things that AI systems can do. And so typically that's where our conversations go. And I'll say that's quite different, I think, from a lot of the broader discussions about ethical AI and trustworthy AI, which frankly can be had without real fear of consequences. And so for that reason, there's a wonderful paper that a nonprofit Algorithm Watch published, just focused on the number of organizations releasing AI ethics guidelines. And so many different organizations have. But then one level deeper, You really want to get into basically consequences when things go wrong, and that's where, as a law firm, that's where our conversations tend to focus.
So, Bob, in your conversations with your fellow CXOs, what's your sense of what people are doing out there?
Yeah, I think in my conversations right now, I think people are trying to figure out the difference between, we've been building these complex systems for years, right? So what is the real difference between these AI systems we're building and what we built in the past? So the conversation is really around, where do you draw the line between AI and automation? Optical character recognition, is that really AI, or is that just an automated tool we use for translating text into, letters into text? And I think this really gets down to, what is the definition of AI? For me right now, when I think the word AI, and why I'm a chief AI officer here, is when you're doing AI, it's ultimately doing automation, but you're basically trying to automate something that would typically take some human cognitive reasoning, right? And so I think that's the subtle difference between what we've done in the past around automation, and what we're doing right now around AI, right? When we're driving cars, that's doing something on par with a human, and the behavior changes, right? So I think that's the other definition around AI is, when behaviors change, that's hard. Like when you buy a tool and it doesn't change, how it's going to behave. With real AI, the behavior is changing over time.
So let me actually make it a little more concrete for you, Bob. So one class of models, for example, these large language models, right? So that many people use. I mean, I use it all the time these days as part of some larger NLP pipeline. So typically people will take some pre-trained model, maybe fine-tune it, and if the fine-tuning works out, then they can deploy, right? So what do these large models that maybe someone else pre-trained, what are the implications of that for you and your team?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, right, so if you take a large, a Hugging Face or something that Google or Facebook trained, the companies or the startups I'm talking with right now, they're putting layers of making sure, you don't get inappropriate hate messages or hate language coming out of these pre-trained models, right? And this gets back to where you have to constantly watch the behavior of these AI systems, right? Because they're changing over time. Whether these big models get retrained or you update them, right? So I think your analogy here is correct, right? These big models we're building on top of more complexity, right? We're all building on top of big complex models that we don't fully control sometimes.
Honestly, sometimes I think about the Python's ecosystem, right? So every time you install a Python library, it just installs so many dependencies.
Yep.
That we depend on an ecosystem that has so many dependencies. The dependency graph of these libraries can be scary at times.
And I think that's what when you think about open source, that's a whole different topic of complexity, right? If you look at where the whole, industry is headed right now, we're all using, 20, 30, 40 different open source packages to build something, and you're right. The trail of dependency goes down a pretty deep rabbit hole.
And that's a great point. By the way, Bob, I'm intrigued by your title, Chief AI Officer. So what prompted Juniper to stand up a Chief AI role?
Yeah, if you look at this specific case here, right, Juniper acquired my last company, NIST, in 2019. And our first mission here was really to extend cloud AI across the enterprise portfolio. That was APs, wireless switches. And really, we're trying to extend that across the broader company. So there's really two missions. One is on the product side, how do we extend cloud AI across the Juniper portfolio? And then there's this other dimension around governance. How do you govern AI going forward in the future, right? And this is our discussions around ESG. What does it mean to have investors and customers start to ask us, what is your policy on AI? What are your principles and guidelines? So I think there's two dimensions. One is on the product side and one's on the governance side across the company.
So previously, when we spoke, one of the areas you folks were quite engaged in were in NLP and chatbots, for example, right? So take chatbots or conversational AI. Are there any specific things you are doing now to make those systems more responsible and trustworthy?
Yeah, and I would say the conversational interface, here, we're working on specifically really to build something that can troubleshoot and manage and operate networks on par with, human IT domain experts, and really that conversational interface is the key to trust, right? And we talked about, the user trust, right? How do you get a user to really trust an AI assistant? And my analogy is always it's on par with hiring a new person, right? If you have someone join your team, that person has to earn your trust. You have to be able to interact with this person. You have to be able to interact with this AI assistant. And that's where the conversational interface comes in, right? The days of dashboards, I think, are giving way to the days of natural language. You want to interact with your AI assistants like you would with any other new member on your team. And you want that AI assistant to really earn your trust. And you want that AI assistant to actually get better with time. The more time you spend with it, you want the trust that AI assistant is actually learning.
Let me bring Andrew Burt back into the conversation. I know that you and your firm were instrumental in this new AI risk framework from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which is a standards body here in the U.S. and quite influential. If you look at, for example, the cybersecurity space, a lot of people look to NIST guidelines in that space. So recently, you were part of a team that helped put together the NIST framework for AI risk. So at a high level, what is it, and what has been the feedback?
Yeah, so just for background, so it's actually quite exciting. We're the first law firm in the history of NIST to be given a research grant, and what we have been doing is conducting research and providing counsel in support of this big effort. It's called the AI RMF, the Risk Management Framework. That effort is a congressionally mandated effort and basically a task NIST with setting some standards for how to manage risk for AI, very similar to what NIST did about a decade or so ago on setting standards for how to manage cybersecurity risk. And so basically where things stand is there was the first draft of the RMF that was published a few months ago. The final draft is going to be ready by January, and so we're actively, supporting this effort. And for folks who are not familiar with what's kind of actually inside, there are really four components to the RMF. There are 3 M's and a G, so map, measure, manage, and then govern. And so basically, govern means having policies and procedures across a whole organization, and then map, measuring, and manage are 3 different functions that are applied to specific AI systems. And so I will leave it at that. I'm happy to go deeper, Ben, if you want me to go into the weeds, but otherwise that's the high level overview.
So what has been the feedback since the release?
That's a good question. There are people better than me who know the in-depth feedback. I think the feedback has been positive generally. I think one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the project, but is its potential for impact. And frankly, I think the Wild West nature of right now, AI risk management efforts. I think every organization approaches it pretty differently. Again, it's a little bit like the Wild West. And so trying to put some cohesive strategy on top of that and cohesive framework, I do think there's a little bit of friction. And so I think some organizations have been basically saying, this is not enough. This is not stringent enough. And I think other organizations have been saying, this is way too detailed and granular. And so I think my impression of the feedback is that it basically suggests that right now the RMF is kind of the happy medium. But for folks who are interested, NIST is actively seeking feedback, and you can actually give them feedback directly. And you can look, I think if you just Google AI RMF, you'll see all the existing documents on the website, and there are different methods for getting in touch with the official NIST team.
By the way, a few validation points. I have seen the NIST framework cited in papers, even by leading AI teams. So that's a good sign, right?
Yeah, I think, again, one of the reasons, honestly, there are a bunch of reasons why we're so excited and frankly, honored to be actively supporting it. But I think it really, of all the different efforts at setting a unified standard, I think it's the one that's most likely to succeed. And again, just like looking at what happened with cybersecurity, I think to some extent AI is today where cybersecurity was, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Everyone knew that risk was an issue. A lot of incidents were happening kind of behind the curtains. They weren't being widely reported. And it took a bunch of different things to make InfoSec more standardized. And so having a national level standard, it's not mandatory, it's not regulation, but having a national standard that organizations can compare them to, themselves to, I think is going to go a long way. So it's awesome to see, research folks already citing it.
In preparation for this Twitter Spaces, I dug around and mined some data, and I looked at, for example, job postings, and around the topics that we're talking about today, discussing today, responsible AI, and it's clear from just looking at job postings that top of mind for companies in this area, Andrew, are security and privacy. So I mean responsible AI in general, and then fairness, and then trust. So really, it's that basic, can we make the AI system secure and make sure it doesn't violate privacy? That's still at the top line.
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole list of different types of liabilities that AI can create. But at a high level, we really just talk about 4, and just like in the order of what clients seem to be, concerned about. It's fairness and privacy are far, far and away the top concerns, and far, far and away the top incidents where we get called in. There's some type of fairness incident. There's some type of privacy incident. The other 2 are security and transparency. And I think over time, security and transparency of AI systems are going to, their profile is going to increase as a concern. But in our experience, across our client base, that's typically what we tend to see.
Yeah. It seems like I joke with people in this space that it seems like a lot of the concerns right now tend to be theoretical, because they can't even name like a actual concrete incidents of model inversion or model extraction. It's all kind of papers and research projects, right? So.
And I would say, Ben, an interesting example where AI, it's all about fairness, whether it's AI or anything. There was a case where a city basically created an app for reporting potholes, and what they found out was it turned out that rich people tend to have cell phones more than poor people. So what happened there turned to be an unfairness, right? It turns out all the potholes that got reported were in the good side of town. So that's an example. No matter what you do with fairness, whether it's AI or anything, you always have to be on the lookout, right? You always have to make sure you haven't built some unfair component into the system. Now with AI, it's a little bit trickier because sometimes you're not aware of it. It happens in the training session that you're not maybe fully aware of.
So let's close by just speculating a little bit about how this space will evolve. So, Andrew, since you talk with a lot of data and AI teams and chief legal counsels, so are you seeing kind of more focused roles, so hiring more focused talent around these topics? So, or is it still kind of something that data teams and ML engineers have to do as part of their broader portfolio of tasks?
I'll give you a real lawyer's answer, which is it depends. And in fact, some of the data scientists I used to work with a long time ago got me a sticker for my computer that just said "it depends," because that's typically what lawyers say. And so the reason why I'm saying that is because a lot of what matters is like the scale and size of the organization, and then also how serious the organization is about AI. If in reality AI to that organization is mostly about marketing, then chances are less that they're going to have devoted, dedicated resources and teams focused on AI risk. But I think what we see, across our client base at B&H, is we see increasing concern from legal departments and also data science teams who want to do the right thing and also don't want to get in trouble, but increasing concern as there are new laws on the books related to AI. And so I think it kind of started in the privacy offices, which tend to house the most technically sophisticated lawyers. And what we are seeing, I'd say, over the last year or so, is instead of the chief privacy officer or someone in that office being responsible for managing AI risk, we are starting to see specific roles reporting directly to general counsel that are focused, specifically on AI. So something like associate or senior counsel for AI is a title that we're seeing more and more, and their role is to interact with and oversee the risk side of a lot of what the data scientists are building.
And so, how about you, Bob? How are you approaching staffing for these topics?
I was kind of echoing Andrew here. It's like we are also starting to see more privacy. It started with GDPR, right? It started kind of with the cloud privacy data discussion. So you also inside of Juniper and other large companies, you're starting to see more people here responsible for making sure data privacy is happening. So that I agree with. Chief AI officer, right? Even my own role here right now, we're starting to see more and more companies put data privacy, chief AI officers in place to really help kind of look at the governance aspect of this.
With that, thank you, Andrew and Bob, for a spirited discussion, very practical takeaways and ideas that you shared with us today.